Watchmen. It's the biggest selling, most critically acclaimed, and perhaps the greatest graphic novel of all time. And until now, I hadn't read it, but we're going to review it one issue at a time. That's right. I hadn't read Watchmen until now. And someone suggested that I just read it one issue at a time, give it some time to breathe and digest it before I try to just read it all at once. And maybe that'll help. And I was like, you know what? That's a pretty good idea. And so we're going to review Watchmen one issue at a time, starting with chapter one. Now, Watchmen is written by Alan Moore with art by Dave Gibbons and colors by John Higgins. And it starts out as, a pretty standard detective story. There are a group of police officers investigating the death of this man, this huge, hulking man named Edward Blake, who apparently has been thrown from his penthouse window. We don't really have much to go on as far as the evidence at the crime scene. Just a lot of questions because we find that Edward Blake is really well connected. Vice President Ford is in pictures with him. Like there's just really interesting things going on about Edward, but who wanted him dead and why is the question. And while we don't have a lot of answers to anything, one thing the police do know is they want to keep this investigation on the hush. It's been 8 years since the Keene Act was passed, and the Keene Act basically outlawed vigilante superhero activity. So now the only active superheroes are those that are working for the United States government. And pretty much everyone else retired except this one guy, this vigilante named Rorschach, who is wanted and at large, right? But Rorschach, never gave up superheroing. And so the cops know that if this leaks, that Rorschach is going to leave a trail of bodies on his way to try to find out the truth about what happened. And so they're trying to keep this on the hush. But hey, speak of the devil, and he shall appear. So the next scene we get after the cops leaving the crime scene is Rorschach grappling up to do an investigation of his own. And what he finds is that the deceased Edward Blake is actually, or was actually, a superhero named the Comedian. And so what he thinks is that someone is out there targeting superheroes. And so he's going to go and investigate all of the superheroes that he knows and also send them a bit of a warning. There's somebody out there trying to get us, right? And so we are slowly introduced one by one to all the members of his former superhero team. We will later know that super team as the Crime Busters. They don't really reveal that in issue one. But we slowly meet all the different members, right? Starting with Night Owl, who is actually the second Night Owl, and his name is Dan Dryberg. He retired, he left superheroing behind once the Keene Act was passed and, doesn't seem to mind not being a superhero and not being in that life. We actually see him at dinner with his predecessor, the first Night Owl, Hollis Mason. And they're just, you could think of them as like the first and second Blue Beetle in a way. There's clearly a mentor relationship and a friendship there. But when Rorschach shows up at Hollis's home to investigate, Hollis is clearly shooken up and is like, what are you doing here? And he clearly feels uneasy. And we do get a bit, right? Like Hollis is like, yeah, man, whatever happened to us? And Rorschach is like, you quit. And then we move on to Rorschach visiting Adrian Veidt or Ozymandias. Ozymandias was a superhero, a member of this Crime Busters team. If I'm not mistaken, he's actually super powered, but basically he retired before the Keene Act was passed and decided to, sort of sell out and merchandise his superheroics. And so he becomes a super successful businessman. And Rorschach's just like, hey, somebody's out there killing supers. Just want you to know. But it's clear there's tension in the room. And then the last two that we meet are Lori Jaspecic, or who was known as Laurie Jupiter, or the second Silk Spectre, and her husband, John Osterman, who is Dr. Manhattan. Now, Laurie clearly does not look back fondly on her days as a superhero. And John just seems to be, or Dr. Manhattan, just seems to be kind of disaffected with like the ways of humanity and is very much into his work as a scientist, like studying whatever he's studying. And it's funny because his preoccupation with science seems to be a point of contention in his relationship. And so Lori decides to leave, go out for some air, and she actually goes and meets up with Hollis Mason, that first night owl, for them to kind of debrief and just sort of connect after the news that Rorschach's given everyone. And, we kind of close with them just sort of taking in this information and just sort of, you know, um, acclimating themselves or just kind of taking in the shock of it all and wondering, why would somebody want the comedian dead? And it's funny because, as Rorschach is going around giving this news to everyone, the question on his mind seems to be, why am I the only one that cares? And so, funny enough, when I read this book for the first time, I read it in this Dollar Comics Watchmen issue. And this actually cuts out a pretty crucial section of the book. So Dollar Comics Watchmen #1 stops right here. And you got to buy the graphic novel to read the rest. But if you actually were to pick up this graphic novel or the original series in any format, then what you would find after that last page is this section of prose that is blown out by my camera. But what this is a chapter in the book called Under the Hood. And Under the Hood is the memoir that Hollis Mason, or not Hollis Mason, the first night owl actually wrote. The first night owl, his name was, the first night owl is Hollis Mason. So it was Dan Dryberg who Laurie met up with after the fact. But anyway, Hollis Mason writes this excerpt or this memoir, and in it he details, why he became a superhero. And my thought process when I read this book and why I never really got into it was, this book just feels dark for the sake of darkness. Like, why is everyone so sad? And so I never finished reading the book. But if you read the prose bit at the end, Hollis Mason, the first night owl, sort of details his fascination with superheroes and why he felt compelled to join them. He was inspired by the first generation of superheroes, which was just dudes dressed in costumes. It wasn't like actual superpowered beings. But he comments on the fact that the world is actually morally gray. It's not as black and white as people might have you believe it is, whether it's for your religious beliefs or political affiliations or whatever. And what he was drawn to in like superheroism is that there's good and there's evil, and superheroes fight for good, and that's that. And what's interesting is that prose section in this book is kind of the first glimmer of hope we get in this series at all. And it was that section of prose that kind of changed my mind about this issue and about whether or not I wanted to continue. Because now we're not just in a dark, bleak, grim world for the sake of darkness, but we're in a dark, bleak, grim world that used to be bright and hopeful, or at least seems like it did. And maybe over the course of the next 11 issues, we will learn how it descended from that place to where we are now. Now, it's worth noting, or I should comment, that the Watchmen story, like the book itself, is done so masterfully. The line art by Dave Gibbons, like, it's a masterclass. It is amazing. It's right up there with like The Killing Joke and literally anything else you've ever seen as like some of the greatest comic book panels ever drawn. Like, nothing is out of place. These 9-panel grids, everything makes sense. Like, the storytelling is on point. Now, this book has been recolored, and so depending on what version you have, it's going to look a little bit different. But both versions, like the recolored version and the original version, look really good. But everything is clean. Every line seems placed purposefully, and I love it. I love a lot of things about the way this book looks. And then on top of that, the narration itself, like there's a lot of like meta stuff in the book between, like, for example, this opening panel. The book opens with a close-up shot of that button, and it zooms out from the floor or the ground where the button is to the top of the penthouse where the dude's investigating, right? And then the next, or the final scene in the comic, shows a close up of the button in Dan Dryberg's hand and zooms out to reveal, like, again, another like top floor view of them looking down on the button. And I'm like, that's pretty interesting. I guess who's watching them is the question that invokes. But there's a lot of little things like that that will have you looking at this issue wanting to reread it over and over again. And like I said, that prose section at the end does sort of breathe a new life, and it's crafting a whole separate world. And so it's like, man, that dude Alan Moore was on a whole different level when he's writing this, to be able to have your background characters, have every character, but then to have full on chapters of backstory about one character in particular who doesn't even appear to be a main character, but he's like a background character. It's like this world is super fleshed out, and I can understand why, just on a critical level, people love Watchmen, because to my knowledge, there'd been nothing like it before and not quite anything like it since. But overall, my thought on Watchmen issue 1 is, my goodness, this is a dark book, and you got to be in the mood to read it. But there is at least that glimmer of hope there in the end. So I'm intrigued enough to at least read issue 2, and I'll report back with my thoughts. Now, let me know. Have you guys read Watchmen? And when you did you read it all at once and love it? Did you do like 51st dates with it and try out issue 1 like 4 or 5 times and, finally let it stick after like the 5th time? Maybe, just maybe, you picked this up, decided to read it, and saw prose in the back, and you were like, yeah, I'm skipping all of this because I came for a comic. What was your experience like? Let me know in the comments down below, and be on the lookout for the rest of this series that I'm tentatively calling Watching the Watchmen. I'll see you in another one soon. Peace.